Hello again, everyone. Phil Dawson here with the Magic the Gathering unofficial Magic the Gathering audiobooks podcast. Quick reminder to join the Patreon if you can. Just search my name at patreon.com, Phil Dawson, and you'll find what we're handing out there, and you can support at any tier you want. Also, I want to say thank you to someone else who took the leap of joining the supporter list through Spotify or through Anchor. Now, I'm notified when that happens, but I don't get any information about the supporters, so I can't give you a shout out or anything, but thank you so much. And also, because I'm based in Japan, I actually can't access any of those funds that I receive from that. But it does stay securely in my Anchor account. It's just not yet accessible. You may remember when I was doing ads for Anchor Podcasting, and that was a paid dealio, and I hit the limit of what they'll pay for, which they do up to $50, $15 for every 1,000 plays, but I can't access it because of the payout system they use. Ugh, whatever. But it doesn't matter, and it doesn't stop me from saying thank you, and I really do appreciate the support, even though I don't know who you are. Meanwhile, for our patrons, I posted our first behind-the-scenes pics. You can get a look at my studio. Oh, yeah. And I'll keep coming up with things to hopefully make the experience of supporting the podcast even better. Anyway, thank you. Check out the Patreon. Search my name, Phil Dawson. You'll find it. And as always, feel free to give me your feedback. Phil and Sendai on Twitter or Instagram. Let's get it going. Chapter 17. Zancha awoke with her butt on the ground and her back against an apple tree's broken trunk. Torn branches with upside-down leaves blocked her view of the world. There were green apples piled in her lap, the crook of her throbbing arm. The portal explosion had thrown her so hard she shattered a tree when she fell, but Urza's armor had kept her whole. Ratapi stood among the branches, looking anxious, but not at her. "How long was I out?" she asked, reaching for the water skin he dangled with her good arm. "A bit." He dropped the water skin in her lap. Whatever had his attention wasn't letting it go. She pulled the cork with her teeth and took a swallow before asking, "What's out there?" "He came out of nowhere. As soon as you'd fallen, his eyes blazed lightning and fire." Zancha imagined the worst. "Another Phyrexian?" She tried to stand up, but armor or no armor, Phyrexian or no Phyrexian, she'd taken a beating, and her body wasn't ready for anything. Latching onto the hem of Ratapi's tunic, Zancha dragged herself upright. The awe-inspiring invader had been Urza, not another Phyrexian. Garbed in stiff armor and looking like a painted statue, he contemplated the metal and oil wreckage. He carried an ornate staff, the source of the lightning web that ebbed and flowed around him. Zancha thought Urza had lost that staff ages ago when they were dodging Phyrexian ambushes. She wasn't entirely pleased to see it again. Her battered arm wanted out of the armor. Zancha would have preferred to wait until she had a better sense of Urza's mood, but there wasn't time for that. She silently recited the mnemonic that dissolved the armor. Her arm swelled immediately. "Has he said anything?" "Not a word. The way he looked, I got out of his way. Might have been better if there had been another Phyrexian for him to fry." "Might have," Zancha agreed. If there'd been an upright Phyrexian in the vicinity, Urza would have had another target besides her. She couldn't remember the last time he'd come charging to her rescue. In point of fact, she didn't think he'd come to her rescue. Since they'd gotten to Dominaria, Zancha's heart had sat gathering dust on a shelf in Urza's alcove. She didn't think Urza had given it a second thought in over a century, but she wasn't surprised that he'd been watching it closely while she and Ratapi were away. She imagined it had flashed when she hit the tree. Best get it over with, she decided, and said to Ratapi, "You wait here." Though there was no chance that he'd pay attention, and she was grateful for the help clambering through the tangled branches. "Been a long time since I've seen a complete one," she said casually, starting the conversation in the middle, which was sometimes the best way when Urza was rigid and wrapped in power. "You should have known better than to engage with Phyrexian with my brother beside you." Urza was angry. His eyes were fire, his breath sulfur, smoke, and sparks. Zancha winced when they landed on her face. He either hadn't noticed or didn't care that she wasn't encased in his armor. She was groping for the words that would calm him when Radapi spoke up. "This is my idea. We wouldn't have gotten into trouble if I hadn't badgered into tracking the riders away from Tabarna's palace." Urza turned without moving. "Palace?" He followed her heart between worlds and didn't know where precisely they were. "Pincher City's a short, hard ride for 6 men on good horses," Zancha said and pointed northward. "We spotted the riders going out to a sea gate at sunrise. It was my decision to get involved when I saw them laying down an ambulator's nether end." "An ambulator? Here?" Urza turned his head, looking for one. He was in the here and now again. Zancha relaxed. "We blew it up in the fire pots. They had the nether end here. I'm sure they didn't want to go through to get to the prime, and I didn't want to risk carrying a loose nether around with me, especially not what after came out. I swear I was expecting sleepers, and at the outside, a tender priest. Nothing like this." Urza rolled the wreckage with his staff. Bright, compound eyes looked up at the sun, metal parts clattered, and Radapi leapt a foot in the air, thinking he was still alive. "They've sent a demon," Urza mused, slipping out of Effin and into his oldest language, pure ancient Argivian. "Not a demon," Zancha corrected, sticking with Effin. "Some new kind of priest. Not as bad as a demon, but pretty bad when you're expecting a cadre of sleepers." "How do you know what it was if you've never seen it before?" Radapi asked. A reasonable question, though Zancha wished he hadn't been staring at Urza's eyes as he asked it. "Yes," Urza added back in Effin. "How can you be sure?" He tipped his staff toward one of the 2 Effin corpses laying near the Phyrexian. "Are they sleepers? They have the smell of Phyrexian around them." Zancha swallowed her shock. Urza had long admitted that she was better at scenting out Phyrexians, but he'd never hinted how much better, and she'd never tried to put the distinction into words, any words from any language, including Phyrexian. "This is a priest," she nudged the wreckage with her foot, "because it looks like a priest." "That's not an answer," Radapi chided. "I'm not finished." Zancha got on her knees and with her good hand attempted to loosen the Phyrexian's triangular faceplate. It was a struggle. The tenders had completed it carefully, and it had recently received a generous allocation of glistening oil to bind whatever remained of its flesh to its metal carapace. Once she got her fingertips under one sharp corner, Radapi helped her pry it off. Shredded leather clung to the interior of the plate, matching the shreds of a skinless but still recognizably childish face that it had covered. "It had completed eyes," Zancha explained, indicating the coiled wires emerging from the empty sockets. "Only the higher priests and warriors have complete eyes, and it had an articulated mouth. That's definitely priest complete. Diggers and such, they just have boxes in their chest, and all the metal's the same, not scraps. That's priest complete, too. It's got no guts, just an oil bladder. A priest's got muscle and nerves. Completed, of course, joined with gears and wire, but it's got the brain it was decanted with. The brain makes it go. That's why most Phyrexians have 2 arms, 2 legs. It's brain, nose, 2 arms, 2 legs." "You said they weren't flesh," Radapi interrupted, a bit breathless and green-cheeked. He told her once that he hadn't been able to help with the butchering on his family's farm. Probably he wished he hadn't helped her now. "This isn't flesh," she tore off a shredded bit. Not surprisingly, he wouldn't take it from her hand, but Urza did. "This is what flesh becomes when it's completed. They start with a living man and transform him to this." Urza's voice was flat and cold as he ground the shred between his fingers. "They start with a newt," Zancha said flatly. "So this is what would have happened to—" Radapi couldn't finish his thought out loud. "If I'd been destined to become a priest." She could remember the Zancha who waited, hope against hope, for the tender priests to come for her. Would she have been happier if they had? There was no Phyrexian word for happiness. "And my brother," Urza flicked the shred into the weeds. "Did he become a priest? Is that what I fought in Argoth? His skin had been stretched over metal plates, over coiled wire. What was he?" "A victim," Radapi answered before Zancha had a chance. "What about the demons and the sleepers?" She chose to answer the easy part first. "Sleepers are newts, uncompleted, the way we came out of the vats. But there's oil in the vats, and the smell never goes away. That's how I spot 'em." "This one recognized you?" Radapi always had another question. Zancha shrugged. "Maybe, if I hadn't gotten its attention first." She rubbed the hollow of her neck. "That left arm, Urza, it shot something new at me. Your armor barely stopped it, and for a moment I was glowing blue, and Those canisters you made for the fire pots, the glass shards are worthless, but for the shrieking ones, they brought this priest to its knees. Urza snapped the wreck's left arm at the shoulder with no more apparent effort than she'd needed to break a twig. He angled it this way and that in the sun as glistening oil poured over his hands. Do sleepers know what they are? Yet another question from Radapi. I was destined to sleep, and I knew, so I assume they know, but I think lately that I'm wrong. The sleepers I've seen don't seem to recognize one another, don't seem to know they weren't born. And if you're going to ask, she pointed to the effing corpses, they're not sleepers. How do you know? Urza demanded. How can you be certain? They're man-shaped, not like you, and they smell. Zancha rolled her eyes. Gix corrected the man-woman mistake before they X-rated him. Sleepers were men and women before I left the first sphere. Phyrexians know about gender. Urza, they just decided it's the way of flesh and not the way they're going to follow. These effins, they've got oil on the outside from handling the ambulator. Right now you smell of glistening oil. Sleepers have oil on the inside, in their breath. So you cover your mouth? Radapi asked. She nodded. He'd watched her do that more than once. If they're not breathing, you might have to cut them open to be sure. Have you cut them open to be sure? Urza asked. Zancha answered. I've always been sure. She met Urza's eyes. They were mortal brown just then. How many times in the past 200 years had she sent him out to confirm her sightings? He always said she'd been correct, always told her to never risk encountering them again. But had he ever scented a Dominarian sleeper? I have to cut them open, Urza confessed. I've killed and eviscerated men and women because they've smelled faintly of Phyrexia, but when I examined them from outside, I saw only men and women. Not what you have become, what my brother became. Even on the inside, there was nothing unusual about them. They had a black mana essence, but essence isn't everything. It doesn't make a man or a woman Phyrexian. Zancha didn't know what to say and was grateful when Radapi asked, what about demons? The demons are what they are, and that is an answer. They're as old as Phyrexia and old as the ineffable. They're powerful, they're evil, they smell of oil, of course, but in Phyrexia, I knew a demon when I saw one because I felt fear inside of me. Mishra met a demon. Radapi's eyes were glazed. His attention was focused between his ears, where he heard the Weakstone sing. Gix. The bees in the orchard were louder than Radapi's whispered declaration, but he got Zancha's attention, and Urza's too. Names are just sounds, Urza said, the same as he'd said when Zancha told him, long before she read the Antiquity Wars, the only demon's name she knew. The Brotherhood of Gix was ancient before I was born. They venerated mountains, gears, and clockwork. They were susceptible to Phyrexian corruption after my brother and I inadvertently broke the Thran lock against Phyrexia. But neither they nor their god could have been Phyrexian. Gix promised everything. He knew how to bring metal to life and life to metal. Radapi's voice remained soft. It was hard to tell if he was frightened by what he heard in his mind or dangerously tempted by it. Radapi. Zancha reached across the wrecked priest to take Radapi's hand. It was limp and cold. Those things didn't happen to you. Don't let Gix into your memory. Gix was excavated more than 3,000 years ago, immersed in steaming acid and thrown into a pit. He can't touch you. You cannot seriously think that there is a connection between the memories placed in your mind and those in Mishra's, Urza argued. At best, there is a coincidence of sound. At worst, remember, Zancha, your thoughts are not your own. Haven't you learned? Still clinging to Radapi's hand, Zancha faced Urza. Why is it that everything you believe is the absolute truth and anything I believe is foolishness? I was meant to sleep here, right here in Dominaria. I dreamed of this place. I was decanted knowing the language that you and Mishra spoke as children. There's something about this world above all the others that draws Phyrexia back. They tried to conquer the Thran. That didn't work, so they tried to get you and Mishra to conquer each other. Now they're trying a third time. Big wars didn't work, so they're trying lots of little wars. If you would listen to someone else for a change instead of always having to be the only one with right answers, Radapi squeezed Zancha's hand, helped her to her feet. Zancha's got a point, Urza. Why here? Why did the Phyrexians come back to this world? Urza walked away rather than answer that, and this time he didn't come back. I shouldn't have challenged him. Zancha leaned against Radapi, grateful to have someone to share her misery with, and aware, too, that She would have spoken much differently if there hadn't been 3 of them gathered around the Phyrexian wreckage. I always lose my temper at the wrong time. He was so close to seeing the truth, but I had to have it all. You're more like Mishra than I am. Radapi wrapped his arms around her. Must have been something Gix poured into your vat. He was jesting, but the joke made Zancha's heart skip a beat. What had Gix said on the first sphere plane? She remembered the spark and walling herself within herself, but the words hung outside of memory's reach. What had happened to Mishra's flesh? Flesh was rendered, never wasted. Had she been growing in the vats while Urza and Mishra fought? She thought she had. Zancha leaned back against Radapi's arms and saw the thoughtful look on his face. Don't, she said, a plea more than a command. Don't say anything more. Don't think anything more. Arms tightened around her, one at her waist, the other cradling her head. She couldn't see his face, but she knew he hadn't stopped thinking. Zancha hadn't either, though there were neither joy nor satisfaction in any of the conclusions. We've got to leave, she said many silent moments later. Someone's going to wonder what happened to the writers. If we're lucky, someone, something. If we're not, Zancha grimaced. Radapi's humor was missing its mark, and her arm, compressed between them, kept her edgy with its throbbing. Whichever, we're going to have to leave this for something else to sort out. I should have shoved the priest through before we destroyed the ambulator. Then there wouldn't have been anything for Urza to look at. Not sure whether that was good or bad. Radapi let her go and did most of the work assembling their supplies in a pile for the sphere to flow around. One look at his face and Zancha knew he was disappointed that they weren't returning to Pincher City, but he never raised the subject. Her elbow had swollen to the size of a winter melon, and her arm, from the shoulder down, looked as if it had pumped full of water. Her fingers resembled 5 purple sausages. Her arm was rigid, too. It had been centuries since she had an injury Urza hadn't healed. She'd almost forgotten how newts stiffened when they broke their bones. If Zancha had the nerves Radapi had been born with, she would have been curled up, whimpering on the ground. As it was, she was grateful for Radapi's company, sought the calmest wind streams through the air, and brought them down frequently. Twice over the following several days, they spotted gangs of bearded men riding good horses through the summer heat. She grit her teeth and followed them, still hoping to find a Shroud stronghold, but both times the men ended their treks peaceably in palisaded villages. Either the religious fanatics had gone to ground, or they'd gone from dreaded to welcome in little more than a season. She thought of going up to the gates and inviting herself into their councils, as she had scarcely a season earlier. Her arm kept her from acting on those thoughts, though. It was your idea to disperse those villagers, let them spread the word that it was Red Stripes who were killing and burning in the Shroud's name, Zancha reminded Radapi as she guided the sphere to its prior course. You're the one who told me that I was a friend because I was the enemy of your enemy. What did you expect? Not this, Radapi replied with a scowl. Maybe I'm wiser now. The enemy of my enemy still has his own plans for me. Zancha let the provocative comment slide. High summer was a season of clear, dry weather on Galmany's north coast. They rounded the western prong of the Orin Ridge without excitement and hit the first of the big southern coast storms at sunrise the next day. For 3 days they camped at a bear's hillside den, waiting for the rain to stop. Zancha's arm turned yellow. Her fingers came back to life. Knuckle by spasmed knuckle. Zancha was in no hurry to get back to the cottage. Once her elbow recovered from its battering, she could enjoy Radapi's company and his attentions. There was always a bit of frustration. She simply didn't have the instincts for romance or even pleasure that Radapi expected her to have. They loved and laughed and argued, walked as much as they soared the wind streams. They didn't see the cottage roof until the moon had swung twice through its phases, and there was a hint of frosts to come in the mountain's morning air. He's there, Radapi said, pointing at the lone figure. Zancha blinked to assure herself that her eyes weren't lying, but it was Urza, tall, pale-haired, and stripped to the waist beside the hearth, vigorously stirring something that bubbled and glowed in her best stew pot. She almost thought of Urza as a scholar, a man whose strength came from his mind, not his body, though Kayla had written that her husband built his own artifacts and had the stamina of an ox. Over the centuries, Urza had become dependent on abstract power, using sorcery or artifice rather than his hands whenever possible. The sight of a tanned, muscular, and sweating Urza left Zancha speechless. She would have preferred to approach this unfamiliar Urza cautiously from the side, but he spotted the sphere and waved. He seems glad to see us? Radapi's voice was guarded. Maybe it wasn't that Phyrexians had no imagination, but that their imaginations never prepared them for the truth. Zancha reminded herself that Urza had her heart on a shelf. He'd followed it to effin' Pincher. He could have found her again or crushed the ember stone in his fist. She brought the sphere down beside the well. Urza ran toward them. Ran, as a born man might run to greet his family. He embraced Radapi first, slapping him heartily on the back and calling him "Brother!" Zancha turned away, telling herself she'd learned her lesson in the apple orchard. Urza didn't have to be sane. He didn't have to see anything except as he wished to see it, as long as he fought the Phyrexian. She hadn't quite finished the self-lecture when Urza put his hands on her shoulders. "I've been busy," he said. "I went back to all those places I'd been before. I trusted my instincts. If I thought it was Phyrexian, I believed it was Phyrexian. I didn't need outside proof. They have a new strategy, Zancha. Instead of fighting their own war or pulling the strings of one big war, they stirred a hornet's nest of little wars just in old Terrasair alone. I have no notion what they might be doing elsewhere. But I'll find out, Zancha. I know Dominaria less well than I know the score of other planes, but that's going to change too. Come, let me show you." He pulled Zancha toward the cottage. She dug in her heels, a futile but necessary protest. "No, Zancha, this time, I swear to the Thran, it's not like before." He gestured to Radapi. "Brother, you come too. I have a plan." Urza did have a plan. It truly was like nothing he'd done before. He'd drawn maps on his walls, maps on the floor, a map on the work table, and maps on every other reasonably smooth surface in the workroom. No wonder he was working outside. The many colored maps were annotated with numerals she could read and a script she couldn't. None of them made particular sense until she recognized the crescent-shaped capital of Bazarat on their common wall. After that, she recognized several towns and cities drawn upside down by her instincts, but accurate, so far as she could remember. She guessed the annotations included the number of sleepers he'd found in each city and asked, "Are you going to drive the sleepers back to Phyrexia?" "Yes, in proper time. The first time, no one was left and the message was lost. The last time, no one knew what we faced until the very end, and as you pointed out," Urza included Radapi in the discussion, "nobody believed the message. This time, I will take no chances. The Phyrexian have chosen to fight a myriad of wars. I will fight them the same way, with a myriad of weapons. I will expose them. Watch." Urza left her and Radapi standing in the middle of a room while he fussed with a tattered basket. His eagerness and delight would have been contagious if Zancha hadn't watched too many times before. She exchanged a worried, hopeful glance with Radapi when the world erupted into chaos. The chaos was a sound like Zancha had never experienced, sound more piercing than the howling winds between worlds. She tried to draw breath to yawn out her armor, but the sound had taken possession of her body. It shook her as a dog shook its fur after the rain and threw her to the floor. Her bones had turned to jelly before it reached into her skull and shook her mind out of her brain. Control and reason returned as suddenly as they had departed. Except for a few bruises and a badly bitten tongue, Zancha was no worse than dazed. She knew her name and where she was, but the rest was muddled. Radapi stood a little distance away. Zancha realized he hadn't been affected by the attack. But before she considered the implications, Urza was beside her, cupping her chin in his hands, taking the pain away. "It worked!" he exulted before she could stand. "I'm sorry, but there was no other way, and I had to be sure." You did that to me?" She propped herself up on her elbow. "Wind, words, they're both the same. Sound is merely air in motion, like the sea. You said the priest collapsed because of the whistling shot. I have made a new artifact, Zancha, a potent new weapon. It has no edge, no weight, no fire. It is sound." Urza opened his hand, revealing a lump roughly the size and shape of a ceiling spider. Zancha couldn't accept that something so simple had laid her low. "It's too small," she complained. "Nothing so small could hurt so much." "You gave me the idea when you said the oil was inside the sleepers. Sound, if it is the right sound, can move things, break things. The sound this artifact makes is one that shakes glistening oil until it breaks apart." Zancha would have said oil could not be broken if she had not just endured a sound that had proven otherwise. "Do we throw them at the sleepers?" "We plant them in all the places where Zancha scented sleepers," Radapi said from the wall where he had studied several of the maps. Yes, exactly right, brother." Urza left Zancha on the floor. "We will scatter them like raindrops." "Well, we'll set them off. They're too small for a wick or fuse." "Ah, the glimmer moon, brother. A strange thing, the glimmer moon. It has virtually no effect on tides, but on sorcery. White mana sorcery, it is like a magnet, pulling the mana toward itself, sometimes strong, sometimes not so strong, but strongest when the glimmer moon reaches its zenith. So, very simple. I make a spindly crystal and charge one end with white mana. I put the crystal inside the spider in a drop of water where it floats on its side. When the glimmer moon goes high, it tugs the charge into the crystal, which stands it up in the drop of water, and my little spider makes the noise that affected Zancha, but not you or I. It is as good as an arrow. But just a bit more complicated, right to be warned. Geometry, brother. Urza laughed. Astronomy, mathematics. You never liked mathematics, never learned to think in numbers. I've done all the calculations. He gestured at the writings on the wall. Zancha had pulled herself to her feet. Her anger at being tricked had vanished. This was the Urza she'd been waiting for, the artifacts she'd been waiting for. How powerful are they? I was maybe 4 paces away? How many will we need to flush out all the sleepers in a city? Hundreds? Thousands? Hundreds, maybe, in a town. Thousands, yes, in a city. The more you have, the greater the effect, though you must be very precise when you attach them to the walls. Too far is bad, too close is worse. They'll cancel each other out, and nothing at all will happen. I will show you in each town we pass through, and I will continue to refine them. Radapi's face had turned pensive. Zancha thought it was because he'd play no part in Urza's grand plan, but he proved her wrong as usual. We could just make things worse. I know Zancha's Phyrexian, but when she fell just now, I didn't guess she fell because she was Phyrexian. You're going to have something make a noise born folks can hardly hear, but a few are going to collapse on the ground. People won't know why. They don't cut up corpses. They've never seen a Phyrexian priest. They'll think it's a god's doing, and there's no guessing what they'll think after that. The sleepers will be gone, brother, dead, lying on the ground. Let men and women think a god has spoken, if that's their desire. Phyrexia will know that Dominaria has struck back, and that's what matters. The message we send to Phyrexia, it is as good as saying that the Thran have returned. I'm only saying that if no one knows why, no one will understand, and ignorance is dangerous. Then, brother, what would you have me do? Urza demanded. Handwriting in the sky, a whisper in every Dominarian ear. Would you have another war? Is that what you want, Mishra? Another war across Terrasair? There's no war. The land is not raped. No one dies. The sleepers will die, Zancha said. In her mind's eye, she saw the first sphere and the other Newts. The other Zancha with its orange hair. She'd slain Newts herself. She'd slain that other Zancha when it got between her and food. But when she thought about vengeance against Phyrexia, she thought about priests and demons, not Newts or sleepers. Her head said they had to be eliminated, killed. The artifact, Spider's sound, had gripped her. She believed it could kill, but not quickly or painlessly. And if her hunch was correct, that many of the sleepers didn't know they were Phyrexian, they wouldn't know why they suffered. Radapi and Urza were watching her. They have to die, she said quickly, defensively. There's no place for them. A shiver ran down her back. Place. One of the oldest words in her memory. Her cadre never had a place. They were oxen, deprived of everything except their strength, used ruthlessly, discarded as meat when there was nothing left. I'll do it, she snarled. Don't worry. Waste not, want not. I'll do whatever has to be done until Phyrexia is rolled up like an ambulator and disappears. Her voice had thickened as it did when she yawned, but her throat was tight with tears, not armor. But it's not true that no one will die. Urza strode toward her. Zancha, he said softly, insincerely. The open door beckoned. She ran through it. Urza tried to call her back. Zancha, no one's talking about you. She ran too far to hear the rest.